It's a great pleasure to be with you here today and to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is Latin America. And all of the time that I was working in Washington, one of the phrases that used to just really grate on me was when I would hear speakers get up and say, we have to be more engaged and involved in Latin America because it is in our backyard. I think nothing could be further from the truth. It's the opposite. It's our front yard. And we're all in the same neighborhood. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important that Latin America be at the top of the agenda for our policymakers. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem to be there. And so I think the discussion today will be especially illuminating because we'll have an opportunity to hear about what are some of the challenges in terms of dealing with issues like poverty, democracy, and human rights. It was telling in the presidential debate the other night that Latin America only came up one time during the entire debate. And in fact, to my recollection, I think that was the only time that it was discussed in any of the four debates, including the vice presidential debate. So it shows how, although some lip service is paid to it, we do need more focus and interest and energy in developing the relationship between the U.S. and all of our neighbors in this hemisphere. It's important to note that on September 11th, 2001, we all remember the terrible events in New York and in Washington. They're seared into our minds and they're seared into our history books. But it's unfortunate that that terrible event overshadowed one of the greatest events that has happened in this hemisphere. It was the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And that happened also on September 11th, 2001 in Lima, Peru. And the signatory to that charter for the United States was Colin Powell. And in that charter, all of the member states of the Organization of American States committed themselves to the principles of representative democracy as the preferred form of government. And it was such a significant event that I think we all should be continued to be reminded that despite what you hear about and read in the newspapers, that overall there is a real yearning and desire for democracy in Latin America. Unfortunately, we see that it is being challenged in a number of countries: Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua. One of the saddest stories really is when you look at Venezuela. They were fortunate to be blessed with the leadership of a man called Raul Betancourt, who was the first really democratically elected president in competitive elections in Venezuela. He served 2 terms and stepped down because he wanted to follow the example of George Washington. He helped to put in place a functioning, competitive, democratic electoral process and system. And it's sad that now we are having to deal with the impact of the work of Mr. Chavez, who unfortunately has turned back the clock, not only in Venezuela, but in also a number of other countries throughout the hemisphere. And I think that one of the points that I think you'll be hearing about today is that having a stable, peaceful Latin America and stable, peaceful Western Hemisphere depends in large part on whether or not the democratic system can really take root. However, there's a lot of challenges to that, and we will be hearing about that a little bit more today. Our speaker today is the Secretary for Political Affairs at the Organization of American States. And one point I would like to share with you is it's often overlooked. The OAS, as it is affectionately known in DC and other parts, is actually the oldest multilateral institution of its type. It preceded the United Nations, the League of Nations, and in many respects it has been was used as kind of a model for similar types of regional groupings of countries. So he works there, and he's very much involved in the whole political and economic development process in Latin America. I had the good fortune of recruiting him to come to work at the International Foundation for Election Systems when I was president there, and I worked with him for a couple years. He served as our senior advisor on political finance, which is a real hot potato, and maybe we'll have to have him back for another discussion to tell us how we can solve that problem. But he left IFAS in 2006 to run for the vice president of Costa Rica. He was elected together with Oscar Arias, who was elected for his second term. And after serving as, I believe, the youngest vice president in Costa Rican history, he wound up moving to Washington. He took over as the senior director for Latin American programs at the Brookings Institution. Some of you may have seen him on television. I was relating last night that actually how I got rekindled was I couldn't sleep one night, and at 3 a.m. I turn on Charlie Rose, and there's Kevin. And he actually got me so awake that I was able to stay and watch the next program on C-SPAN with another mutual friend of ours who was so deadly boring, I went right to sleep. So, but not Kevin. So after the Brookings Institution, he went on to the Organization of American States. He has his PhD in political science from Oxford and has held a number of important positions, has worked with the UN Development Program and a number of other organizations in an advisory and consulting capacity. And it's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Kevin Casas-Zamora.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. Well, I would like to start by saying how honored I am to be at the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. And for making this possible, I would like to thank, of course, first of all, the council itself, Sky, thank you very much, the El Pomar Foundation, the Center for Diplomacy and Democracy, and in particular, my good friend, the indefatigable Richard Sudriet. Richard is that very rare human being that manages to be a transformative leader while retaining his decency, modesty, and affability intact. You know, I would buy a used car from Richard. But not that beachfront property in Tulsa that you're trying to sell me. And I would also like to start by saying that given my current responsibilities, nothing, and in order to be as candid as possible here, nothing that I say here can be attributed to my current employer, to the OAS or to its member states, and particularly not to the Secretary General, my boss. So, all I'm gonna share with you are my personal views on this. And yes, as Richard was mentioning, I'm gonna share with you some views of mine on Latin America and the current state of affairs in Latin America. Coming from Latin America, as I do, you never know whether to be an optimist or a pessimist. There's a cruel and often repeated joke about Brazil, which you can really apply just as much to the region as a whole. The joke says that Brazil is the country of the future and will always be. Indeed, Latin America has a legendary history of failing to live up to its immense potential. Despite possessing natural wealth beyond anyone's wildest dreams and a fascinating human diversity, the construction of prosperous and fair societies where every human being can claim a dignified place under the sun remains a distant prospect. Latin America's voyage towards modernity has been a hazardous experience, with more castaways than sailors. More often than not, the image of Latin America seems defined by an outsized reality that manifests itself in unspeakable tragedies. Yet, there's far more than tragedy in Latin America. There's also hope. The hope of seeing the region's giant, Brazil, finally emerging as a world power. The hope of millions and millions of families throughout the region joining the middle classes. The hope of a continent that, with blemishes and reversals, is trying really hard to build democratic systems. Thus, in the next 40 to 45 minutes, in typical Latin American fashion, I will give you good and bad news. The good news is that when it comes to both poverty and inequality, Latin America is doing better than a decade ago. And that over the past few years, global crisis included, the region has done remarkably well. The bad news is that those achievements are, for the most part, due to a good economic cycle, and that they will not be sustainable if the region does not confront very structural, political, economic, and social issues that are the very heavy ballast that keeps it from taking off. Both the welfare gains experienced by Latin American societies and their hard-won democratic achievements are doomed to reversals unless three key problems are tackled head-on. The first one is the weakness of institutions. The second one is the region's uncertain path towards integration into the world economy. The third one, and arguably the most pressing one, is the endemic crime and violence. Before I go into them, I would like to express an inevitable caveat. Making generalizations about Latin America is a risk endeavor because the region is remarkably heterogeneous. There are several Latin Americas. The Human Development Index, which is this contraption put out by the UN that basically combines in a single indicator education figures as well as healthcare figures as well as income figures in one single indicator. The Human Development Index of Chile and Argentina is at roughly the same level as that of Poland and Estonia. Whereas in terms of human development levels, Haiti is at the same level as Sudan. When we think about income per capita, the richest country in the region is more than 12 times as rich as the poorest country. In terms of size, the economy of the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil alone is 62 times the economy of Nicaragua. So beware of generalizations about Latin America. In what follows, I'll pay particular attention to Central America. This is obviously related to my personal background, but also to the fact that Central America offers, in many ways, a distilled version of the problems that affect the whole of Latin America. The challenges of poverty, inequality, democratic frailty, economic uncertainty, and above all, violence are found in particularly vivid tones in the small Central American countries. With these qualifications out of the way, let me talk about the good news first. The good news is very straightforward. Despite a whole intellectual industry devoted to claiming that globalization is destroying our societies and generating an unprecedented increase in poverty, that's not what the data says. In the decade between 1999 and 2009, the proportion of the Latin American population living under the poverty line fell by about 11 points to about 1/3 of the total. That includes remarkable performances in countries with left-wing governments, such as Venezuela, where it fell by 22 points, in countries with moderate policies, such as Brazil or Peru, where it fell by about 12 points, and in countries with rather conservative economic policies, like Honduras, where it fell by 11 points. In virtually every country in the region, the trend is down. What is even more remarkable is the behavior of income inequality. As you probably know, particularly those of you who have been to Latin America, inequality is the original sin of Latin America. The region has long experienced the worst income inequality levels in the world. This has a number of very disturbing implications, some of which we'll talk about later on. It turns out that in 10 out of the 13 countries for which we have comparable information of the Gini coefficient, I mean, the Gini coefficient, and we'll go back to that in a second. The Gini coefficient is sort of the standard measured, the standard indicator used for income inequality. It ranges between 0 and 1, with 1 being perfect inequality and 0 being perfect equality. So the lower the number, the more egalitarian, say, a society is. The higher the number, the more unequal a society is. It turns out that in 10 out of the 13 countries for which we have comparable information of the Gini coefficient, income inequality went down, in most cases, by a little. This is remarkable because turning inequality around is a truly titanic struggle for any society. Something, by the way, which is good to bear in mind in this country. What's the story here? The story is, to a large extent, one of economic growth, pure and simple. In the second half of the previous decade, say between 2003 and 2008, 5-6 years, Latin America as a whole grew very rapidly, more than 5% per year. The region had indeed not seen as good a run of economic growth in nearly half a century. Moreover, with the exception of Mexico and Venezuela for its own reasons, most of the region emerged from the early part of the global economic downturn in 2008 and 2009 relatively unscathed, particularly in the case of Brazil. The recent economic growth in Latin America has come coupled with a greater capacity to put in place effective social policies. Social expenditure in the region, that is, what the countries invest in public education, public health care, public housing, and pensions, has increased from 13% of GDP, 13% of the economy 20 years ago, to about 16% now. Moreover, and this is very interesting, the region has shown the ability to innovate in the realm of social policy. The concept of conditional income transfers, i.e. direct subsidies to poor families that are handed out in return for behavioral changes, for instance, in return for keeping children enrolled in school or taking children to get their vaccination. That's a Latin American invention that for now has really traveled widely across the developing world. So that's all good, but let us not get carried away. The fact of the matter is that having 1/3 of a population below the poverty line is still an embarrassment. It means that more than 200 million Latin Americans are unable to meet their basic needs. And as for inequality, it has come down slightly in most places, but we're still world champions by far. The construction of cohesive societies in Latin America continues to be an enormously difficult endeavor. What these figures mean is simply that Latin America is doing better than in the past, not that it's on the verge of becoming Switzerland. In fact, I have the nagging impression that the foundations for some of these achievements are distinctly fragile. and that the region still have great difficulties in facing up to some of its most entrenched demons. And I was saying last night that that is very often the case that Washington gets into a frenzy around a particular catchphrase. And the flavor of the month, when it comes to Latin America, the little that is discussed about Latin America in Washington is summed up in this phrase that this is Latin America's decade. And it's become commonplace to repeat that. And it's wonderful. As a marketing tool, it's phenomenal. But when you scratch beneath the surface, you start having doubts. And I, in particular, I get very anxious when all this hype takes over. So in what follows, I guess I'm going to try to be the contrarian, and I'm going to try to punch some holes in that story, and perhaps leave you with a more sober view of what's happening in Latin America, of the challenges that are taking place in Latin America. So I was saying that that some of the foundations for some of the achievements that I just laid out are rather fragile, and that the region still has great difficulties in facing up to some of its most entrenched demons. To three of those deep challenges I now turn. The first challenge is of a strictly political nature, and I would call it, for lack of a better term, the weakness of political power, or perhaps the weakness of institutions. There are many signs of this weakness, but none is more important or far-reaching in its effects than the fiscal feebleness of the state in Latin America. Concerning the tax structure, the situation in pretty much the whole of Latin America is truly lamentable. Comparatively speaking, the region has a tax burden that is unacceptably low. I was telling yesterday that, quite frankly, no matter where you go, with the possible and rather odd exception of Brazil, taxes are not collected in Latin America. That's truly one of the key issues that the region has to solve. At 17%, 17% of GDP, the average tax burden in Latin America stands at less than half of the average tax revenue collected by industrialized countries. The tax burden in Latin America is, in fact, below the tax burden in sub-Saharan Africa. This is bad enough, but what is even worse is the way in which those taxes are collected. Well over half of the taxes are indirect taxes, i.e. taxes that are not sensitive to the wealth of taxpayers. Compounding the fiscal weakness of the state, we have in Latin America another huge problem: the lack of bureaucratic capabilities. For the longest time, we in Latin America, as elsewhere, have been mired in a very tiresome discussion about the size of the state, but we tend to devote much less attention to its efficacy. And the fact of the matter is that state apparatuses in Latin America are amongst the least capable in the world. According to the World Bank's governance indicators, and I encourage you to check on this. I mean, there's a wonderful, wonderful for people that like this kind of stuff. I mean, there's a wonderful website where a whole series of indicators regarding governance developed by the World Bank can be accessed. And the story that they tell is not pretty. When we speak about government effectiveness, control of corruption, or the rule of law, the Latin American states are way, way below states in industrialized countries or even East Asian countries. And here comes a personal anecdote. It is worth noting that whenever these rankings are made, my country, Costa Rica, appears close to the top of Latin America. That's a sobering thought, I have to say. I can tell you out of direct experience in government that in itself is very telling. For when you're in government in Costa Rica, you constantly ask yourself, if collecting more taxes is justified. Even someone like me who's very convinced of the need of a progressive tax reform as one of the keys to the future in Costa Rica, you constantly ask yourself whether collecting more taxes is justified, given the terrible incapacity of the state to spend the money effectively. Any stint in the Costa Rican government allows you to see clearly that the problem in many Latin American countries is less the excess of bureaucracy as commonly claimed by the private sector, but the utter lack of a modern, merit-based bureaucracy. This combination of fiscal and bureaucratic weakness impinges directly on the ability of the state to do something about the unacceptably high levels of poverty and inequality in the region. In Latin America, the state is bad at raising taxes, and it's worse at spending them. Unsurprisingly, the effect of public policy on inequality levels is very limited. And here I would encourage you to take a look at the handout that was distributed, which I think contains a very interesting nugget of information. This goes back to what I was mentioning a few minutes ago, the Gini coefficient. I mean, the figures that are given here are Gini figures. Remember, the higher the figure, the more unequal a society is, the lower the figure, the more egalitarian or a society is. The white bars tell you the story of the Gini coefficient in both Latin America and Europe, and in a set of countries for each region. The white bars are inequality before taxes and transfers. That's basically the income inequality that comes from the marketplace, you know, from the salary, the structure of salaries in the economy, that kind of thing. The blue bars are the inequality that remains after taxes and transfers. That is, after the state has sort of intervened in the marketplace. And these figures are very interesting, because what you see here is essentially that when it comes to the workings of the marketplace itself, the income distribution before taxes and transfers in Latin America and in Europe is actually very similar. It's not that different. The big difference comes after the state intervenes. The state in Latin America barely, I mean, through tax systems and through transfers, i.e. through taxes and public spending, barely changes the income distribution. It makes virtually no difference. That's certainly not the case in Europe. In Europe, taxes and transfers do make a huge difference when it comes to inequality. I'm showing you this so that you don't take my word for, you know, the assertion that I just made, that the effect of public policy in Latin America in terms of redressing inequality levels is very limited, because states in Latin America are simply you know, their level of the capabilities deployed by the state, their ability to be effective in terms of redressing what is truly one of the region's key problems, like inequality, is simply very limited. So you have the fiscal weakness, but you also have the weakness in terms of bureaucratic capabilities, as shown here. The fiscal and bureaucratic weakness of the Latin American states has myriad consequences, but there are two that I would like to mention now. A society that is unable to do something about the privation and inequality almost certainly must contend, first, with very high levels of violence, and second, with a certain kind of politics where the populist temptation becomes a permanent danger. Both things are bad news for democratic stability. More fundamentally, weak states have great problems creating national institutions able to exert effective control over their territory, which is something that we are seeing, particularly in Central America. I mean, some of the states are so weak that they truly have no control over their territory. So it's no wonder that they've become easy prey to organized crime. To the syndrome of the feeble state apparatus, we have to add an equally debilitating political disease, which is an alarming representation deficit and the resulting obliteration of parties and party systems. If support for democracy is relatively low, comparatively speaking, in Latin America, about 59% of the population in the region prefers democracy to any other political system. In developed countries, the figure is to the north, typically to the north of 80, 85, 90%. The figure is much lower in Latin America. If support for democracy is relatively low in Latin America, trust in basic democratic institutions such as judiciaries, parties, and legislators is much, much lower. More worryingly, democratic attitudes are significantly weaker amongst the young and to a lesser extent the poor. The issue of the young is clearly disturbing and pops up in every piece of research done on democratic attitudes in Latin America. For the older generation, which lived through a long authoritarian nightmare, democracy was something to strive for. This does not seem to be the case for the young in Latin America. They know democracy, and what they see, they do not like. They have grown to believe that all politicians are corrupt, that elections change very little, that parties and leaders come and go, and yet glaring inequalities and limited opportunities stay the same, while crime and violence get ever worse. The young in Latin America strongly feel that they are not being represented at all by political parties. They suffer from an extremely severe case of political disaffection. In their political hostility, which doesn't bode well for the future of democracy, the young suffer from an especially intense bout of a societal disease. The fact of the matter is that outside Uruguay and maybe Chile, political parties hardly represent not just the young, anyone in Latin America. Some of it has to do with the endemic corruption and with the consistent inability of parties and politicians to turn expectations into realities, partly because the power levers of a feeble state are useless to get anything done. As a result, parties come and go, crushed under the weight of popular disaffection. In some countries, we have seen the emergence of something that I would have thought unthinkable: the party-less democracy. Guatemala and Peru are, for instance, are very much at that stage. But in less dramatic fashion, we have seen the erosion and fragmentation of relatively solid party systems in countries like Panama and even Costa Rica. The erosion of parties and party systems has generated a disturbing trend throughout Latin America: the return of the strongmen. Something that is happening in the left and in the right of the ideological spectrum. And here, again, given my current responsibilities, I'm going to be very careful. Some people say that we are seeing this in countries like Venezuela, like Ecuador, like Nicaragua, as much as some people say that we are seeing it in Panama. Aided in nearly all these cases by the tampering with presidential re-election clauses, which is interesting. The sum of these political pathologies, a fiscally starved state, institutions with low levels of efficacy, and unrepresentative parties, results in weak political authorities, embedded in weak political institutions and endowed with weak political power. Even with the best of intentions, democratically elected politicians in Latin America exhibit an exceedingly limited ability to nurture development processes and a growing helplessness vis-a-vis other de facto powers, such as business, media conglomerates, and more worryingly, organized crime. And this is not a speculation. A few years ago, in the course of the research that led to the United Nations report on democracy in Latin America, a process in which I was personally involved, more than 250 Latin American leaders were asked the simple question of who holds power in the region. And the answers were quite striking. Nearly 80% of those interviewed mention business conglomerates and the financial sector as having a lot of power in Latin America, while 2/3 mention media. Conversely, the executive branch was mentioned by barely 1/3 of the sample. And the legislative branch was mentioned by less than 13%. This was a stunning admission of the powerlessness of formal politics in Latin America. Weakness, of course, begets weakness. While it is abundantly clear that measures such as progressive tax reform, civil service modernization, and the steps to support party systems, for example, adequate public funding systems, are sorely needed in Latin America, it remains unclear who will break the cycle to make the state and its democratic institutions relevant. Relevant, that is, to the purpose of redressing the immense social imbalances that have made Latin America's journey towards modernity a treacherous and often tragic one. The second big development challenge concerns Latin America's uncertain and uneven integration into the world economy. And here, I'm going to use the case of the Central American countries, which I think reveals better than most the great difficulties that middle-income countries, and most Latin American countries fall into this category, the great difficulties that middle-income countries have in adapting successfully to economic globalization. Let us start by saying that all Central American countries are very open economies, for openness is a must for economies of their size. The region has understood that it doesn't have any option but to embrace globalization. These countries were very quick on their feet to sign and ratify free trade agreements with the US, i.e. CAFTA, as well as Panama's free trade agreement, recently ratified by the US Congress. And, it must be said that the US remains a vital economic actor for Central America. Bilateral trade between the US and Central America is in excess of $40 billion per year, about the same, remarkably, as between the US and India. Moreover, with the exception of Panama, these Central American countries have negotiated comprehensive trade and cooperation agreements with the European Union, and in the case of Costa Rica, also with China. All that, in my view, is positive, indeed necessary. The problem is that for all practical purposes, the easy phase of integrating Central America to the world economy is over. This is not just because a period of easy expansion of the world trade is behind us. Perhaps more importantly, the task ahead for Central America is more complicated than simply signing free trade agreements galore. If these small economies want to be viable, they now have to tackle the truly difficult task of raising the productivity level of their labor force. The weaknesses that must be overcome are very structural. The poorer countries in Central America have followed a model of international insertion largely based on cheap labor, an option that has translated itself into a predominant role for the export of agricultural produce, as well as textiles and garments. For instance, textiles and garments comprise nearly 70% of US-bound exports in the case of El Salvador and Honduras. At the very least, it is questionable whether such a model will be sustainable in the light of the emergence of China, India, and even Vietnam. Other countries, particularly Costa Rica and Panama, have better prospects. They have much more sophisticated economic structures in which services such as tourism and banking, as well as some kinds of high-tech manufacturing, play a significant role. These countries, however, find themselves in a kind of middle-income trap. They cannot compete by the cheapness of their workforce, but they still have not reached the technological threshold that would allow them to compete by virtue of their value added. They are in a sort of economic no man's land. How to increase productivity in Central America calls for a set of very difficult undertakings, including increasing education expenditures that outside Costa Rica and Panama are dismally low. On current trends, despite some improvements, by 2015, almost 3/4 of the Central American workforce will still lack a complete secondary education, including almost 1/3 that will not have finished even the primary education. It also requires improving road and port infrastructure that outside Panama is among the very worst in Latin America, and bringing research and development investments beyond the pitifully low levels that they have now. This is a point, the latter is a point that I want to emphasize. At 0.3% of GDP, the resources that Costa Rica invests in research, development, and innovation are far and away the highest in Central America, 0.3%. Yet, that percentage is less than half the figure for Latin America as a whole, and is 1/15 the figure for Israel. The number of resident patent filings per million inhabitants in Guatemala is roughly on a par with that of Kenya or Yemen. Yemen, that is virtually a failed state. You don't have to be a fortune teller to foresee the difficulties that Guatemala will have to keep pace with the 21st century. Also, the region must lend a hand in myriad ways to small and medium-sized businesses that are 97% of firms in Central America and which only rarely sell their products abroad. Ultimately, the region must find ways to reduce drastically the 40% of the labor force that currently works in informal jobs with negligible productivity. All this demands enormous public investments of different kinds and a state that works, which of course takes us back to the question of fiscal robustness and in general, stateness. Yet, unless Central America does all that, integration with the world economy will only entrench the traps that Central American countries find themselves in at the moment. Moreover, it will consolidate the terrible social and economic segmentation that we see today in Central America, and the region's growing propensity to export its people. For all the promise that it has for Central America, the fact of the matter is that, as it is today, economic openness is the project of a small, educated minority and not of Central American societies as such. The third major development challenge that I would like to address concerns crime and violence. And this truly is a tragedy of biblical proportions in Latin America. Here I broaden the scope again to the whole of Latin America. More than 1.4 million Latin Americans died in the previous decade alone as a result of crime. 1.4 million. That's all the people in the world. 1.4 million. The murder rate for Latin America is more than 3 times the rate for the world as a whole. Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Venezuela have some of the highest homicide rates in the world, which hover at levels many times above the level where, according to the World Health Organization, homicides become a veritable epidemic. The murder rate in Honduras is more than 16 times that of the United States. I mean, just to give you a nugget of information that I find really striking, over the past 5 years, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, each one of them, has had more murders than the 27 countries of the European Union combined. That gives you, a notion of how serious the problem is. Murder rates are merely the most visible human consequence of the problem. In any given year, over 1/3 of Latin Americans, roughly 200 million people, are victims of a criminal offense either directly or in their immediate household. To this, we have to add several other manifestations of violence whose magnitude we can only guess. More than 50% of the world's kidnapping for extortion occur in Latin America. Different estimates place between 50,000 and 150,000 the number of members of youth gangs known as maras in Central America. These gangs have a significant incidence in the region's violence levels, as well as a growing participation in supporting organized crime. And organized crime is something that I want to stress. In Latin America, and particularly in Central America, violence and its dire social, economic, and political implications cannot be understood but in terms of the pervasive presence of organized crime, particularly drug trafficking. Close to 90% of cocaine destined for the U.S. transits through the Central America and Mexico corridor. It is not coincidental that Central America exhibits the highest murder rates in the world. The consequences of this tragedy are multifold and go beyond the obvious human cost. There are economic implications, which become clear when we think that more than half the murder casualties in Latin America are young men between 15 and 29 years old, at the peak of their productive and reproductive lives. The best estimation of the direct and indirect cost of violence in Latin America puts it at about 12% of the region's GDP, 12% of the region's economy, which is a sum roughly equivalent to the entire economies of Argentina and Chile combined. That's a huge dead weight for any region. But it is the political consequences that I would like to emphasize here. The perception that state authorities are unable to protect the citizens' most fundamental rights is visibly damaging the support for democratic institutions in Latin America and becoming a breeding ground for authoritarian attitudes. According to a recent study by José Miguel Cruz, a scholar at Florida International University, nearly half of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean is willing to support a coup d'etat if it helps to solve insecurity problems, a reaction that no other social problem elicits. The Latin American population, as frightened as it is eager for public order, is heeding carefully and often rewarding at the ballot box populist rhetoric that offers the iron fist and a cavalier attitude towards the rule of law to solve the crime problem. This is unfortunate, for the record of iron fist solutions to crime is poor. Honduras offers a poignant reminder of this. In Honduras, the enactment since 2002 of successive legislative packages to deal with crime, with very clear repressive overtones, has not made any difference at all, not a iota of difference. At 91 murders per 100,000 people, Honduras's murder rate in 2011 was far worse than a decade ago and was the highest in the world by a long margin. For all the tough talk about iron-fisted solutions, a sustainable reduction of crime levels in Latin America requires far more than the use of coercion. It demands a comprehensive policy combination that gives priority to reforming notoriously corrupt and ineffective police forces, introducing modern technology and information systems to sustain policy decisions, strengthening social ties and the organization of communities, and above all, investing a lot more in education, health, housing, and opportunities for the youth. Such is the road traveled by successful experiences in Latin American cities such as Bogota and Sao Paulo, which have managed to slash violence levels in little more than a decade. With 80 murders per 100,000 people, Bogota was one of the world's most dangerous cities in 1994. In 2011, with 21 murders per 100,000 people, it was one of the safest capitals in the Western Hemisphere. Balancing zero tolerance for crime with zero tolerance for social exclusion offers a way forward even in dire circumstances. Drug trafficking deserves a final mention. Dealing with this phenomenon, which is at the heart of the security discussion in the whole of Latin America, demands a multi-dimensional response, in which, of course, the use of intelligence and state coercion are inescapable. To that, we have to add efforts to prevent consumption and provide adequate treatment to addicts. Above all, we have to add a vigorous diplomatic dimension aimed at showing that this is a problem that far exceeds national boundaries and hence demands a true hemisphere-wide dialogue between drug-producing, drug-consuming, money laundering, and transshipment countries. Such a diplomatic effort must encourage a profound revision of counter-narcotic policies in many countries, hopefully including the US. It has become increasingly obvious that the so-called war on drugs has been a very costly failure, which has generated all sorts of deleterious implications for the hemisphere. A serious international dialogue on counter-narcotics efforts in the hemisphere is essential to improve the security situation in Latin America and to reduce the grave risks that the region's democratic systems are currently facing. Fortunately, we are witnessing the beginnings of such a conversation. At the Summit of the Americas held in Cartagena, Colombia last April, where all the heads of government and heads of state of the hemisphere, including President Obama, got together, the current leadership in the hemisphere engaged for the first time in a frank public debate on the merits of the status quo of counter-narcotics policies. It is too early to know what will come out of this discussion, but at the very least, the region has taken a crucial step with regards to drugs. We have abolished the prohibition to think. What's the moral of this tale? I'm not sure if there's only one lesson. However, if I were to pick one, I would say that the lesson here is that democracy becomes a perilous journey in the absence of a state that works. Democracy is doomed to live on the edge if the presumed instruments of self-government, i.e., a set of state institutions that ultimately respond to the people, are starved to death, deprived of muscle and brains, incapable of solving concrete problems for concrete people. Democracy lives dangerously when those state institutions are largely unable, as they are in most of Latin America, of redressing social imbalances that render impossible the existence of a democratic polis. Largely unable to provide the public goods upon which economic growth and human development ultimately depend. Largely unable to protect the basic core fundamental rights, including life, physical integrity, enjoyment of private property, and freedom from fear that provide the glue that keeps together any social contract. We thus go back to an old insight of the late Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington. Before we ask about the form of government that developing countries have, we must ask about the degree of government they enjoy. Let us be clear about what we mean here. It is not that the democratic institutions that Latin American countries have built are irrelevant, or that we ought to be agnostic about the methods, whether democratic or authoritarian, used to build effective state institutions. Far from it. As one of the finest thinkers of our time, economic Nobel laureate Amartya Sen would argue, democracy is always relevant, precisely because the effectiveness of the state that really matters lies in its ability to contribute to human development, a project that only has meaning with democracy at its core. In the absence of a state that works, democracy is not worthless. It is simply less effective and more prone to breakdowns. If democratic institutions are to be preserved in Latin America, tax reform, civil service reform, police reform, judicial reform, party reform, amongst many, must be tackled with the same zeal as the creation of credible electoral authorities or the registration of voters. Over the past 2 decades, Latin America has done very important things, but that's not to say that they are the most difficult things. Having civilian governments born out of regular elections is a tremendous achievement, essential for human development. But this is far less difficult than the tasks that are pending. It is the same as with any of us. Being born is the most important step of our lives, but it's far easier when compared with the 20 or 40 or 80 years that follow. It is what we do day in and day out over a prolonged period what defines if our birth will unleash the wonderful potential for human nature or will end up engrossing the populated graveyard of wasted opportunities. The democratic transitions in Latin America threw a lifeline to the region, but today that lifeline is at risk of being wasted. So far, carrying out the reforms that are needed, particularly tax reform, has been extraordinarily difficult in Latin America. If the previous generation was successful in returning the military to the barracks and making possible that governments change hands by the ballot and not by the bullet, we, the current generation of Latin Americans, have a much more complicated task before us. We must reform our political institutions so that they are capable of nurturing more cohesive and safer societies, but must do so without destroying democracy in the process. I'm not sure how to do this, although I have a few ideas. What I do know is that shirking from doing this is not a viable option for the future. I'm afraid that burying our heads in the sand in the face of the challenges that I have identified here, the weakness of the state, the collapse of political representation, and the deterioration of public security, is courting a disaster that will inevitably arrive. Thank you.
That was incredible. I hope the students in the room, Air Force Academy, other students here, anybody from CC here, one of the best broad overviews and passionate summaries of a region that I think you'll probably ever hear. That was really incredible. We have about a little under 20 minutes for questions. So who's first? Oh, this is not a shy group. Yes, thank you, please. A comment, not a question, but I too noted that there was much of the conversation and the characteristics do not exist only in Latin America, and that there are elements of that that might find their way here as well, and that we need, as the lady said, to tend to our own gardens so we can be good neighbors. And we have a question on the left. How can other countries assist?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I mean, just a short comment on your first intervention. I agree with you. I mean, this is not just about Latin America, and as seen from the outside, it is slightly disheartening that in the course of the U.S. election, Latin America barely gets mentioned. And if you take a look at the presidential debates, Latin America barely featured in the discussion. And this I find surprising. I mean, this is I think a tremendous example of that old saying that the urgent always trumps the important. Because the fact of the matter, and I mentioned this last night, that when you take a closer look, I can't think of any other region that has the impact on the daily lives of the American people as Latin America does. I mean, in myriad ways. I mean, the fact that Latin America is a very significant energy provider to the U.S., the fact that it's the source, for good or ill, I mean, we can discuss a lot about this, of most immigrants that come to the U.S. I mean, the overwhelming source of immigrants is Latin America. The fact that obviously Latin America has a very important role in something that the U.S. cares a lot about, which is the whole issue of drug trafficking and all this, the counter-narcotics policies, as I was mentioning in my presentation. That's a conversation that is impossible to have without, making reference to Latin America. You can list a whole range of issues. I mean, the fact that economic exchange between the U.S. and Latin America is roughly of the same size as between the U.S. and China, and that Latin America is a very significant market for U.S. exports. I mean, all those things, when you add them up, you arrived at the conclusion that really the impact of Latin America in daily lives here in the U.S. is enormous. And yet, I mean, you barely hear a word said about this in the course of the presidential campaign. So it's a pity. That's all I can say. I mean, it is what it is. And yes.
How can people help? How can
Yes.
help?
Well, depends on the issue. It depends on the issue. If you ask me about, say, the counter-narcotics issue, the drugs issue, the U.S. can obviously help a lot. I mean, I wish this country, and I think it will come in time. I wish this country made a more vigorous effort of the kind this country is used to. I mean, this is a phenomenal country in terms of the freedom it has to discuss, public policy options. The very fact that you have 50 states, which are, as we know, laboratories for public policy in all sorts of different ways. This country could have a very interesting discussion when it comes to counter-narcotics policies. I mean, so far it's been very close to impossible to have it. I mean, that's why I mentioned that the big step that seems to be happening now is that for the first time we're abolishing, particularly in Washington, we're abolishing the prohibition to think. I mean, when it comes to counter-narcotics, the status quo, I mean, the state of the discussion in Washington is more or less like this. And this is really bizarre. The status quo is not working. The status quo cannot be changed. Go figure. So really, the fact that we're starting a frank discussion in this country as well as in the hemisphere is a momentous, it's a hugely important change. And this is one of the issues in which what the U.S. does definitely is likely to have a very significant impact in Latin America. On other issues is more difficult to see, quite frankly. I mean, reforming education systems and providing opportunities for young people and reducing impunity levels in Latin America is incumbent on us. I mean, it's something that the Latin Americans have to take seriously. It's something that has to come from within. Collecting taxes, that's something that the IRS cannot do for us.
We got some agents.
So really, I mean, those are truly structural development issues that have to be tackled from within. I mean, I certainly hope that the political consensus to do something serious about them will emerge in due course. But when it comes to those issues, you know, we need all the help we can get. But the help, whatever help we get, would only matter at the margins of the problem. The problems must be tackled from within and from, you know, by Latin Americans themselves.
I'll summarize and simply say, I mean, the role of civil society in moderating a society and facilitating conversation and reducing violent crime.
And making democracy grow as well. I totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, and in that regard, I have to say, generally speaking, Latin America is not doing that bad at all. I think one of the things that you see mushrooming all over the region is a very vibrant civil society. And actually, you know, one of the big political changes taking place in Latin America is that, I mean, I don't know if political parties ever had the monopoly over political representation in Latin America. They do not now. And one of the reasons why they do not have a monopoly over political representation is because many of the channels to represent and to give voice to the interest of society and the aspirations of society have emerged. I think that's, you know, the only possible exception to that is in extremely violent countries where collective action becomes more difficult. But even in those countries, I mean, take the case of Mexico. In Mexico, I mean, one of the interesting stories that has emerged over the past 2 years is a very interesting social movement against violence. So I think that's one of the things that Latin America is doing well. I only wish that political parties had the wisdom and the ability and the nimbleness to adapt to a very significantly transformed political landscape and engage in a more positive dialogue with civil society organizations. That's where I think they're not doing that, and they're paying a very significant price as a consequence.
Cadet in the back.
Excellent question. How do you fight violence, given that Mexico is dealing with this, but in Costa Rica there is no military? How do you fight violence without a sizable military establishment?
Right. Well, let us establish first what kind of violence we're talking about, because there's violence and violence. I mean, the kind of violence that you see in a country like Costa Rica, I would venture that even that share of violence that is connected to organized crime, and there is a share of violence that is connected to that, does not need a military establishment to be confronted effectively. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, one of them, the most obvious one, is that, you know, the military is not trained to do that. I mean, the training that you guys get is of an entirely different nature, and it should be so. That's the way it should be. It's a different question. It's a different question, perhaps, in those cases in which the integrity of the state as such is in peril. And those situations are very exceptional. I can think of the situation in Colombia 10 years ago. I can think of the situation perhaps of certain regions in Mexico, where really, I mean, the ability of the state to exert effective control over the territory was at stake. I can perfectly see the rationale for sending in the military to deal with the problem. But that's a stopgap measure. And that has to be considered an exceptional measure. An exceptional as in that it has to be limited even in time. Ultimately, you cannot deal with either common crime or organized crime if you don't have the judicial and police institutions in place that are able to secure, that are able to protect the rule of law and to reduce impunity levels. And that's where the real challenge for Mexico lies. And to his immense credit, much as President Calderon in Mexico has been criticized for sending in the military, I think, there are fair criticisms to that. He has definitely understood, and this has been often overlooked in the assessment that a lot of people make of what's going on in Mexico. He has definitely understood that the core of the challenge that Mexico has is about rebuilding from scratch law enforcement institutions worthy of that name. That's the success of Mexico and the rest of the region in doing that will define whether we are successful in dealing with the terrible crime levels that we have in the region. It's not about sending in the military. The military is at best, and in very exceptional cases, a stopgap measure, but it's not a way of dealing with the problem in the long run.
And this gentleman's going to get the last question. Interesting question to end on. Yeah. The proposition, if you couldn't hear, was that, we are, and you were diplomatic in not making this point, we are the large consumer that, somebody said something about that sucking sound you hear. Well, that was about something different, but this one is about the consumption of drugs on this side of the border. So the proposition is, would it make a difference? So you really get to go out on a limb, and we'll not tell your employer at all. Would it make a difference, in your sense, if that were to be, as the gentleman suggested, legalized and taxed and taken out from underneath the criminal network? I'll let you handle that one.
Thank you. I'll give a diplomatic answer that also happens to be my genuine position, by the way, on this. There's a lot of talk about legalization these days, and a lot of people are sort of waving, the issue of legalization as the silver bullet to deal with all problems connected to drugs and drug trafficking and all that, both here in the U.S. as in the rest of the hemisphere. Look, that may or may not be true. I really don't know whether that would be a solution or not. Actually, when a lot of people in Washington start, peddling, and I'm thinking here, the folks at the Cato Institute, for instance, typically, they go around the world saying, it's a bunch of dummies, that they have not understood that it's all about legalization, and if only we did that, our problems would be over. Well, first of all, legalization of what? Because, it's one thing to talk about, even very reasonable people. I'm pretty sure that a large share of this audience would be willing to at least countenance the possibility of legalizing marijuana.
We have it on our ballot.
Well, there you go. So, that's a reasonable discussion. Are we talking about legalizing heroin and meth and allow, a lot of toothless people go around town because meth is legal? So, legalization of what? This is my first question. Second, there are it's fairly likely that some of the criminal organizations that trade in marijuana, for instance, will probably shift their activities to other forms of illegal activity. What I'm trying to say is that I really don't think that there's any silver bullet to deal with the issue of drugs, and not even legalization. But ultimately, I don't know. What I can tell you is that regardless of whether legalization is the option, is the way to go or not, I would go back one step. The problem is that so far we haven't had a debate conducive to identifying what the best option is. So in a way, it's a methodological problem. I mean, the first thing that we really need to do, I mean, for me, it's not about embracing legalization as the silver bullet. It's about abolishing the prohibition to think. So if we have a decent fact-based discussion on drug policies, we might arrive to a better set of policies than the one we currently have. If that set of policies is going to embrace the issue of legalization or not, I don't know. But first, before we get there, we need to have a discussion among grown-ups. And that's the kind of discussion that, fortunately, I think we're beginning to have at the hemispheric level.
Kevin, we may want to change the motto of our organization, but I think it is true that a long time ago we did abolish the prohibition on thinking. But you've encouraged us to think a whole lot more and given us a tremendous amount of not only data but wisdom to think about. Now, I know you said last night that this is your first trip to the Rocky Mountains.
Indeed, it is.
And as he mentioned last night, I was struck by that. So this book that Karen has brought for Kevin.
Thank you so much.
Pikes Peak and Garden of the Gods, 2 worlds, 1 vision, and I think that actually might actually have more than one meaning. So, Kevin, thank you very much for being with us. And
Thank you so very much.
Yeah.
And thank you all for being here, for being such a wonderful audience, and for all your comments and questions.
Richard,
Thanks.
thanks very much for making this happen.